What if the most powerful man in Britain had been quietly dying for weeks, and the people closest to him were ordered to say nothing? No press release. No emergency announcement. Just silence, locked doors, and a family forced to smile for cameras while everything fell apart behind them. Tonight, we are pulling back the curtain on a royal crisis that shook Buckingham Palace to its core. Because the moment that heir apparent Prince Wesley and senior royal Princess Adelaide stepped in front of those cameras, the official story began unraveling in ways the palace never expected. Stay with us, because this goes much deeper than anyone has admitted. When Prince Wesley and Princess Adelaide stepped forward together inside Windsor Castle, they confirmed what the palace had been quietly managing for weeks. And the thing that made the entire moment so immediately unsettling was not just that King Edmund was seriously ill. It was that the official story about when this crisis actually began completely contradicted everything the royal family had been telling staff, and the public right up until Wesley stood at that lectern. The announcement itself was grim. Wesley kept both hands pressed flat against the wood. Adelaide stood beside him, holding a handkerchief she never once raised to her face. That image alone told you this was not a routine health update. King Edmund had suffered what the palace described as an acute cardiac episode following a private briefing. He collapsed without warning and required emergency treatment. Doctors then discovered cardiovascular complications serious enough to suspend every royal duty indefinitely. Approving state business, meeting government officials, signing diplomatic correspondence, the actual machinery of the monarchy, all of it frozen. Wesley paused during the statement and said, "My father," in a way that made clear he was fighting to hold his voice steady. And Adelaide, who spent decades being the most unflappable member of that family, looked completely devastated. Here is where things get complicated. Because Wesley confirmed through documented medical records that the king had lost consciousness, remained unresponsive for critical minutes, and that specialists had stabilized him, but that recovery would be prolonged and uncertain. That is terrifying on its own. What makes it far more complicated is that Adelaide later disclosed, through a documented private conversation with Wesley, that King Edmund had been suffering breathlessness, dizziness, and chest pressure for weeks before the collapse. Weeks, not days. The king had dismissed every warning as fatigue. He had even laughed when Adelaide urged him to rest. And that detail changes the entire narrative, because it means the palace was not caught off guard by a sudden medical emergency. They were actively managing a deteriorating situation while publicly insisting everything was fine. 3 weeks before Wesley and Adelaide stood in front of those cameras, King Edmund was inside St. George's Hall rehearsing for a formal investiture ceremony. The occasion where the monarch presents honors to members of the public. Halfway through the procession, his right hand tightened around the back of a chair. His face lost all color. And for 11 seconds, he could not answer when Princess Adelaide called his name. 11 seconds of silence. The ceremony was stopped immediately. Doors were closed. Every witness present was instructed to describe the interruption as a scheduling delay, not a medical incident. A scheduling delay. Adelaide reached the king before anyone else, caught his arm as he struggled to breathe, and ordered the rehearsal stopped entirely. King Edmund refused an ambulance. His sister threatened to shut down the entire event unless he agreed to be examined nearby, and he finally gave in. A palace physician recommended immediate rest and urgent cardiac testing. The king nodded, signed off on a reduced schedule, and promised to follow the advice. Then, within days, he began placing official meetings back on his calendar. He believed that stepping back would cause public panic. Adelaide believed he was gambling with his life. The argument that followed took place without any aides present. Adelaide told her brother that courage had become recklessness. He replied that the monarchy could not pause simply because its sovereign felt weak. She struck the chair beside her and told him that duty did not give him the right to force his family to watch a preventable collapse. King Edmund turned away, but he did not deny the danger. That confrontation matters because it proves the family knew the situation was escalating. And yet the incident never appeared in the general royal briefing notes, the daily summaries used to keep senior family members informed. King Edmund had ordered staff not to alarm Wesley during what he called a demanding period. So the heir to the throne was deliberately kept in the dark about his father's deteriorating heart condition, while simultaneously being expected to step into the role the moment everything fell apart. Instead of feeling protected, Wesley felt betrayed. And honestly, the palace chose to frame this as protecting the heir rather than acknowledging it as withholding critical medical information from the very person who would need to take over at a moment's notice. That is the kind of logic that only makes sense inside an institution that has spent centuries prioritizing appearance over transparency. Then another warning surfaced. A documented account from a footman stated that King Edmund had become dizzy after a private dinner and steadied himself against a corridor wall. The king dismissed the concern and ordered that no report be circulated. Queen Constance, the king's wife, had already known about the first episode at the investiture rehearsal. She had urged him to rest, but she later supported his demand for secrecy. Wesley came to view her silence as part of the danger. Adelaide viewed it as proof that fear had overruled judgment. That is a significant fracture. It means the two people now tasked with holding the monarchy together were looking at the queen and seeing someone who had enabled a cover-up rather than protected the king. Constance found herself in an impossible position, caught between loyalty to her husband's wishes and the reality that those wishes were actively endangering his life. But supporting the decision to hide symptoms from the heir and the Princess Royal was never going to look like anything other than complicity once the truth came out. When a physician later asked to speak privately with the king's children, Constance watched the door close between them. She was his wife. And yet, suddenly, she was standing outside the circle deciding what happened next. That moment cut far deeper than protocol. It exposed the fundamental tension between the private family and the public institution. Wesley eventually opened the royal engagement diary in his father's private study and found cancelled medical appointments that had been quietly replaced with official meetings. He closed the book and asked who had authorized the changes. The private secretary answered simply, "The king." That detail is devastating. It confirms King Edmund was not being mismanaged by staff or misled by advisors. He was actively overriding medical advice and hiding the evidence from his own family. Wesley carried the medical file toward the king's suite with Adelaide joining him at the door. For weeks, the king had used his authority as sovereign to protect his secret. Now his son and his sister were about to use love, anger, and constitutional necessity to strip that secret away. The confrontation that followed was not a polite family discussion. Wesley placed the medical file beside his father's bed and asked one question. "Why did you decide we had no right to know?" King Edmund looked exhausted, but his instinct to control the room remained intact. A heart monitor tracked his condition beneath his sleeve, and yet he still asked why the confidential file had left the medical office. The king insisted the crisis was being handled. Wesley did not move. He explained that government briefings, diplomatic correspondence, and palace authorizations were already reaching him, and he could not protect the institution while being denied the truth about the man at its center. His anger finally broke through. He accused his father of treating love like a weakness that needed to be managed. King Edmund fired back that an heir could not be burdened with every private fear. His son answered immediately. He was not speaking as the heir. He was speaking as a child who had nearly learned the truth too late. That line shifted everything. It reframed the conflict. Not as a constitutional crisis between a monarch and his successor, but as a son confronting his father about choices that could have left him grieving without any warning. Adelaide refused to soften the moment. She reminded the king of the investiture rehearsal and the promise he had made to rest. She told him that what he did had not shown courage. It had forced everyone around him to participate in denial. Her voice stayed steady until her final sentence. "You made us help you disappear in front of us." King Edmund finally stopped arguing. Through a private conversation later documented by his secretary, the king admitted that stepping back frightened him more than the symptoms themselves. He believed that once Wesley carried the full weight of the crown, the country might discover how easily the monarchy could function without him. That admission is remarkably honest and remarkably painful. King Edmund had waited his entire life to become sovereign, and the thought of proving the institution did not actually need him was more terrifying than any physical symptom he was hiding. Before sunrise, the official red dispatch boxes stopped traveling to the king's private suite. They were redirected to Prince Wesley. No proclamation had been made. No crown had changed hands. King Edmund remained sovereign. But inside Windsor, the machinery of the monarchy had already shifted. The crown's emergency arrangement allowed senior royals to act for the monarch without removing him from the throne. Wesley took control of high-level government briefings, public engagements, and urgent diplomatic communications. Adelaide managed the royal household, staff, travel arrangements, and the cancellation of duties that might place further pressure on the king. At the first meeting, an aide pulled out the king's chair for Wesley. He stopped him immediately and made his position clear. No one would behave as though his father had already disappeared. The decision earned quiet respect and also revealed how deeply Wesley understood that every gesture inside that family carries meaning. Queen Constance entered before the meeting could begin and demanded to know why Adelaide had approved changes to the royal calendar without consulting her. The princess answered that the king had requested stability, and stability now required decisions without emotional interference. Constance heard more than procedure in those words. She heard an accusation. Then the private secretary produced a recorded instruction dictated by King Edmund himself. The king had granted Wesley authority over external royal duties and asked Adelaide to supervise the household until doctors could determine whether he could return. He also directed them to lead every public health communication. Constance froze. She had expected to speak for her husband. The monarch had chosen his son and his sister instead. Adelaide removed a small key from a black leather case and placed it in Wesley's palm. It opened the dispatch boxes used for urgent state papers. She closed his fingers around it and said, "You are not taking his place. You are holding it for him." Wesley could not answer. That night, King Edmund suffered another brief heart rhythm disturbance. The second warning lasted less than a minute. Its effect traveled through every royal residence. Engagements disappeared from calendars. Cars waiting in palace courtyards were dismissed. Staff were told to prepare for weeks of uncertainty. At Windsor, Queen Constance stood outside the king's room as doctors adjusted the monitors. At his home, Wesley read the update twice before folding it into his pocket and telling his wife Catherine, "This is no longer temporary." Specialists confirmed through a written medical assessment that recovery could take months. Even a favorable outcome would require rehabilitation, reduced stress, and permanent changes to the king's role. A full return was quietly removed from palace planning. Wesley and Catherine sat down with their children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, and explained that their grandfather's heart had become dangerously weak. George asked whether this meant his father would now become king. The question stopped Wesley completely. He finally answered, "It means grandfather needs us to be a family first." That moment captures the impossible position this crisis created. A child asked the most direct question imaginable, and his father had to answer honestly without making the transition feel like a foregone conclusion before the king had even begun to recover. Before the second disturbance, King Edmund had recorded a private message. In it, he thanked Adelaide for protecting him from his own stubbornness. He told Wesley that leadership begins when fear no longer controls duty, and he apologized to Constance for shutting her out. She listened to it alone. When she heard his apology, she stopped the recording and covered her face. Hours later, the king sent a handwritten request through his physician. He wanted Wesley and Adelaide together. No advisors, no papers, no witnesses. When Wesley and Adelaide entered the room, there were no private secretaries present, no doctors standing within earshot. King Edmund had asked for the curtains to be opened, and pale morning light stretched across the floor beside his bed. For once, the king did not begin with instructions. He looked at his son, then at his sister, and admitted that he had spent years believing duty meant never allowing anyone to see him afraid. "I was wrong," he said, "and it nearly cost me everything." King Edmund accepted what he had resisted for weeks. Even recovery would not restore the old pattern of endless ceremonies, official meetings, and international travel. He could still offer counsel and constitutional continuity, but the visible weight of the crown had to move toward Wesley, whether the family felt ready or not. Adelaide listened without interrupting. The king asked his sister to remain beside his son during the transition, because she possessed the kind of honesty he had too often rejected, and Wesley would need it. The princess promised to serve the crown, but made one thing clear. Before titles, protocol, and duty, she was still his sister. Wesley refused to let the moment become a farewell. When King Edmund began speaking as though his reign had already ended, the prince stopped him. He would accept responsibility, but he would not turn a medical crisis into a burial while his father was still alive. His anger no longer came from betrayal. It came from hope. King Edmund finally apologized for the deception. He admitted he had hidden his symptoms because Wesley's growing readiness frightened him. Watching his son succeed would have filled him with pride, but it would also have proved the crown no longer depended on him. Wesley answered quietly, "Being needed and being loved are not the same thing." Those words broke something open between them. By afternoon, the long walk outside Windsor Castle was no longer empty. Families arrived carrying flowers. Veterans stood silently beneath regimental umbrellas. A handwritten sign rested against the iron gate. You served us. Now let them care for you. Across Britain, broadcasters abandoned normal programming. One newspaper front page captured the national mood more powerfully than any speech. A photograph of King Edmund smiling, beside the simple words, "The king must rest." The palace released its second statement before the evening broadcast. King Edmund would remain under specialist supervision and permanently reduce his workload. Wesley would carry the primary public and constitutional responsibilities going forward. Other senior working royals would support him. The words carefully avoided the word abdication, but they confirmed the old routine was over. Queen Constance also accepted the new reality. She stopped fighting to control the health narrative or the palace response. She allowed Wesley and Adelaide to lead the transition while she remained beside the king during his rehabilitation. Her role became quieter, but also more honest. She chose companionship over authority. Late that evening, the palace released a recorded address from King Edmund himself. Seated beside a window at Windsor, he did not hide his weakness or make impossible promises. He thanked the medical team that had saved his life, the public that had waited for him, and the family that had been forced to carry a burden he refused to release. Then he looked directly into the camera and said, "The crown is strongest when duty is shared, truth is spoken, and love is finally allowed to help." He confirmed that his public role would remain permanently reduced. He would continue receiving essential constitutional briefings, but Wesley would represent the crown at major national and international engagements. The change was permanent. It did not remove his title. It ended the old expectation that he had to carry everything alone. Wesley entered after the recording ended and told his father that the message had sounded honest. King Edmund asked whether honesty had made him appear weak. His son answered, "No. It made you sound like my father." King Edmund smiled. The bitterness that had divided them finally disappeared. King Edmund finally rose from his bed with assistance and took several careful steps toward the window. Wesley stayed close without reaching for him. Adelaide watched from the doorway. Constance waited beside the chair. The king looked out toward the people gathered beyond the gates and raised one hand. The crisis had not destroyed his reign. It had destroyed his belief that he had to suffer alone. Wesley carried power without cruelty and proved that loyalty sometimes demands confrontation. Constance learned that love can survive without control. And King Edmund discovered that releasing the burden did not weaken the crown. It saved the man beneath it. The monarchy endured, not because its king appeared invincible, but because at the most dangerous moment of his life, his family finally allowed him to be human. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button, because more stories like this are coming. And share this with someone who needs to hear it today.